In the years leading up to 1941, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia occupied a precarious position at the crossroads of Europe. Formed in 1918 as the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, it was conceived as a unifying state for South Slavic peoples after the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. By 1929, it had been renamed Yugoslavia, but beneath the surface of official unity, sharp divisions endured. Ethnic, religious, and regional identities coexisted uneasily. Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Macedonians, Montenegrins, Muslims, and others maintained distinct political aspirations, often clashing within the fragile framework of a centralized monarchy. These tensions, unresolved during the interwar years, weakened the country's ability to respond cohesively to external pressures. Geopolitically, Yugoslavia found itself encircled by rival interests. To the north and west, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy viewed the Balkans as a critical sphere of influence. Berlin sought access to resources, particularly bauxite, timber, and agricultural products, and valued Yugoslavia's transport routes as potential corridors for military operations toward Greece or the Soviet Union. Rome harbored ambitions in the Adriatic and along the Dalmatian coast, where Italian nationalists claimed historic rights. To the east, Bulgaria sought territorial revision after its losses in the Balkan Wars and World War I, eyeing Vardar, Macedonia in particular. Hungary, meanwhile, hoped to recover territories ceded to Yugoslavia by the Treaty of Trianon in 1920. Further south, Greece and Turkey followed developments with concern, aware that instability in Yugoslavia could spill across their borders. Internally, the political situation remained unstable. King Alexander I attempted to suppress nationalist divisions by instituting a royal dictatorship in 1929, but his assassination in Marseille in 1934 left a vacuum that Regency governments struggled to fill. Prince Paul, acting as regent for the young King Peter II, attempted a delicate balancing act, maintaining neutrality while navigating pressures from the Axis and the Allies. Political parties representing Croats, Slovenes, and other groups resisted central control, while the Yugoslav army, although large on paper, around 12,000 men mobilized in wartime, was poorly equipped and dependent on outdated weaponry, much of it inherited from World War I. The rise of Nazi Germany in the late 1930s sharpened Yugoslavia's strategic dilemma. With the Anschluss of Austria in 1938 and the partition of Czechoslovakia in 1939, German forces now stood directly on Yugoslavia's borders. Italy's invasion of Albania in April 1939 added further pressure, encircling Yugoslavia from the west and south. Trade agreements increasingly tied Belgrade to Berlin, with Germany becoming Yugoslavia's primary economic partner by 1940. At the same time, Britain and France sought to preserve Yugoslavia's neutrality and prevent it from drifting into the Axis orbit, promising diplomatic and financial support. These conflicting external influences placed the Regency in a precarious position, as alignment with one side risked provoking retaliation from the other. Military preparedness reflected these uncertainties. The Yugoslav army was divided into 12 field armies and 3 army groups, tasked with defending a territory of more than 25,000 square kilometers. Yet its equipment lagged far behind contemporary standards. Most divisions relied on horse-drawn transport, and the armored forces counted only around 110 tanks, primarily obsolete French Renault FT models and Czechoslovak Skoda light tanks. The Air Force possessed roughly 450 combat aircraft, but many were outdated biplanes. Morale varied among conscripts, with loyalty to the central government uneven across ethnic lines. Officers were predominantly Serbian, which fueled discontent among Croat and Slovene recruits. Public sentiment was equally divided. Many in Serbia favored closer ties with Britain and France, recalling their alliance in World War I. Among Croats, resentment toward Belgrade's centralized control inclined some factions to consider cooperation with Italy or Germany if it promised greater autonomy. Slovene leaders, facing the proximity of German forces in Austria, adopted a cautious stance. In Macedonia, some groups leaned toward Bulgaria, which promised cultural recognition. Against this backdrop, communist organizations, though suppressed, quietly expanded their networks, preparing for the possibility of resistance should Yugoslavia fall under Axis domination. By late 1940, the Axis war in Europe had reached the Balkans. Italy invaded Greece in October, but initial failures created opportunities for German intervention. Yugoslavia's geographic position, directly north of Greece, now made it indispensable for German military planning. The Regency attempted to preserve neutrality, but the growing inevitability of conflict forced decisions that would determine the country's fate. These preconditions, ethnic divisions, fragile political structures, economic dependency, and military weakness, set the stage for the collapse of Yugoslavia in April 1941 and the reshaping of the Balkan crossroads into one of the most contested regions of the Second World War. In March 1941, Yugoslavia's fragile balance collapsed under mounting Axis pressure. On 25 March, the Regency Council led by Prince Paul signed the Tripartite Pact in Vienna, formally aligning the country with Germany, Italy, and Japan. The agreement promised to respect Yugoslavia's sovereignty and avoid stationing German troops on its territory, but in practice it tied Belgrade to the Axis sphere. The decision sparked outrage among many segments of the population and fueled tensions within the military. 2 days later, on 27 March, a coup d'etat orchestrated by Serbian officers toppled the Regency and declared the 17-year-old King Peter II of age. Crowds in Belgrade filled the streets, chanting slogans in support of Britain and condemning the pact. For Berlin, this sudden reversal represented a direct threat to strategic plans in the Balkans. Adolf Hitler, preparing for the invasion of Greece and ultimately the campaign against the Soviet Union, interpreted the coup as hostile. On 27 March, he issued Führer Directive No. 25, declaring Yugoslavia an enemy state and ordering its destruction. Planning for an invasion began immediately. Coordinated with operations already underway in southeastern Europe, Germany assembled Army Group South under Field Marshal Wilhelm List, with the 12th Army reinforced by panzer and motorized divisions. Approximately 68,000 Axis troops, German, Italian, Hungarian, and Bulgarian, were deployed for the campaign. Against this, Yugoslavia could field around 1.2 million mobilized soldiers, but their readiness, equipment, and cohesion were severely limited. The imbalance lay not in numbers, but in organization and modern warfare capability. The opening phase of the invasion began at dawn, on 6 April 1941. The Luftwaffe launched Operation Retribution, a massive bombing of Belgrade designed both to cripple command centers and to punish the capital for its defiance. Over the course of 3 days, around 440 German aircraft carried out repeated raids, dropping an estimated 360 tons of bombs. Civilian casualties were heavy, with contemporary estimates ranging between 3,000 and 4,000 dead. The Yugoslav Royal Air Force attempted resistance with about 140 fighters, including British-supplied Hurricanes and locally built IK-3 interceptors. Despite some successful engagements, the Luftwaffe quickly achieved air superiority, destroying aircraft on the ground and forcing surviving units to retreat. Simultaneously, German ground forces advanced from multiple directions. The Second Army pushed from Austria and Hungary into Slovenia and northern Croatia, while the 12th Army crossed from Bulgaria towards southern Serbia and Macedonia. The 1st Panzer Group, under General Ewald von Kleist, spearheaded the drive toward Belgrade, moving rapidly through the Vardar Valley. Italian forces advanced from Albania into Montenegro and Kosovo, while Hungarian units entered northern Yugoslavia, targeting the Bačka and Baranja regions. Bulgarian forces, though not directly engaging in major combat, occupied much of Macedonia and parts of eastern Serbia under German coordination. Within days, Axis troops penetrated deep into Yugoslav territory, outpacing the mobilization of defending units. The Yugoslav command structure proved unable to coordinate an effective defense. General Dusan Simović, who had led the coup and now served as prime minister and commander-in-chief, attempted to organize resistance by assigning defensive responsibilities to 3 army groups. Yet, communications were disrupted by bombings, and many units failed to receive orders in time. Ethnic divisions further undermined cohesion. Some Croat soldiers deserted or refused to fight, while separatist organizations such as the Ustaše, actively prepared to welcome German forces. In contrast, Serbian units in central regions fought with determination, but often without adequate support or supplies. The rapid Axis advance created encirclements that trapped entire Yugoslav formations before they could properly engage. By 10th of April, German troops had reached Zagreb, where local collaborators declared the establishment of the independent state of Croatia under Ante Pavelić, leader of the Ustaše movement. This proclamation split the country politically, even before military operations had concluded. On 12th of April, German armored columns entered Belgrade after only 6 days of fighting. The government and King Peter VI fled first to Greece and then to London, establishing a government in exile. Remaining Yugoslav forces attempted localized resistance, but Axis superiority was overwhelming. Within 11 days, the campaign was effectively over. On 17th of April 1941, the Yugoslav High Command signed an unconditional surrender in Belgrade, marking one of the swiftest and most decisive Axis victories in Europe. The collapse of the Yugoslav army, despite its large mobilization, highlighted the mismatch between outdated structures and modern mechanized warfare. It also revealed the extent to which internal divisions made unified defense impossible. The opening phase of the war in the Balkans was thus not only a military defeat, but also the beginning of a profound reconfiguration of the region, as Axis powers prepared to dismantle Yugoslavia and redraw its political map. Following the rapid collapse of Yugoslavia's defenses in April 1941, the Axis powers turned to the question of how to partition and administer the conquered territory. The dismemberment was carried out with both military precision and political calculation, reflecting the diverse interests of Germany, Italy, Hungary, and Bulgaria. Each sought to expand its sphere of influence, secure strategic resources, and strengthen its position in the Balkans. The outcome was the complete dismantling of the Yugoslav state, replaced by a patchwork of occupations, annexations, and new political entities. Germany took the leading role, focusing on regions of strategic importance. Serbia, with its central location and vital transportation routes along the Danube and Morava valleys, was placed under direct German military occupation. Belgrade became the seat of the military commander in Serbia, General Heinrich Dankelmann, later succeeded by General Franz Böhme. The occupation zone included key industrial assets, mines, and communication lines. A puppet administration, the Government of National Salvation, was established under General Milan Nedić in August 1941, though ultimate authority remained with the German military and SS. Serbia's role as a hub for German operations against Greece and the Soviet Union made it a critical area for Axis control. Italy, seeking to expand its Adriatic and Balkan influence, annexed much of the Dalmatian coast and established control over Montenegro. Italian forces also shared influence in Kosovo and parts of Western Macedonia. Rome supported the creation of the independent state of Croatia, NDH, a satellite under Ante Pavelić and the Ustaše regime, which included both Croatia proper and Bosnia-Herzegovina. The NDH was nominally sovereign but heavily dependent on Axis support, with German and Italian troops stationed across its territory. Its creation served German strategic aims by cultivating a loyal local administration, though tensions quickly arose between German and Italian forces regarding spheres of authority. Hungary, motivated by the desire to reverse the Treaty of Trianon, annexed the Bačka, Baranja, Međimurje, and Prekmurje regions, areas with significant Hungarian minorities but also substantial Serb and Croat populations. These annexations were justified on ethnic grounds, but in practice reflected Budapest's territorial ambitions. Bulgarian forces occupied most of Vardar Macedonia and parts of southern Serbia, presenting the move as the liberation of historically Bulgarian lands. For Sofia, the occupation represented both a national aspiration and a reward for alliance with the Axis. The rapid dismemberment of Yugoslavia created a deeply fragmented political landscape. Each occupying power implemented its own administrative structures, laws, and economic policies, often at odds with one another. The independent state of Croatia began instituting radical nationalist policies aimed at reshaping its population structure, while German authorities in Serbia imposed strict control measures, including hostage executions in response to resistance activity. Italian zones were characterized by more lenient administration compared to German areas, but still faced local unrest. Hungarian and Bulgarian annexations integrated the territories into their national systems, including forced assimilation policies. Economically, the occupied regions were exploited to serve Axis needs. Agricultural products, minerals, and industrial output were requisitioned, often leaving the local population with shortages. German authorities prioritized the Trepča mines in Kosovo, a significant source of lead and zinc, as well as bauxite mines along the Adriatic. Italian forces controlled timber and shipping routes, while Hungary and Bulgaria integrated annexed territories into their national economies. The exploitation deepened resentment among local populations, fueling the conditions for widespread resistance. For civilians, the reorganization brought uncertainty, repression, and forced adaptation. Shifting borders meant that communities suddenly found themselves under different authorities, with new laws and identity requirements. Ethnic minorities were often singled out for discrimination, expulsions, or forced resettlement. Refugee movements began almost immediately, as Serbs fled from Ustaše-controlled Croatia, and Macedonians resisted Bulgarian assimilation. The fragmentation of the region not only destroyed the Yugoslav state, but also laid the foundation for a brutal conflict of occupation, collaboration, and resistance that would engulf the Balkans for the remainder of the war. The strategic goals of the Axis powers had been achieved in the short term. Yugoslavia was eliminated as a state actor, and its territory redistributed according to Axis priorities. Yet the political and ethnic divisions left in its wake ensured that the region would not remain quiet. Instead, the dismemberment created multiple fronts of conflict, as rival administrations, occupying powers, and resistance groups began to shape the next phase of the struggle. The dismantling of Yugoslavia in April 1941 was not simply the end of a state. It marked the beginning of overlapping conflicts that would engulf every community. In the immediate aftermath of the surrender, Axis forces consolidated control and resistance began to emerge, though unevenly and often spontaneously. The speed of the invasion had left many Yugoslav troops demoralized, but also scattered throughout the countryside with weapons still in hand. These remnants became the nucleus of early insurgent activity, joined by civilians unwilling to accept foreign occupation. The struggle was complicated by the fragmentation of loyalties. Resistance did not unite the population under one banner, but instead split into competing movements with different ideologies, strategies, and visions for the future. In Serbia, German occupation authorities imposed severe measures designed to deter rebellion. Hostage-taking and summary executions became standard practice. For every German soldier killed, 100 local civilians were executed. For every wounded soldier, 50. Such policies were meant to instill fear, but often had the opposite effect, encouraging armed opposition. In July 1941, communist groups aligned with the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, led by Josip Broz Tito, initiated an uprising that spread rapidly through western Serbia. They formed the nucleus of what would become the Partisan movement, emphasizing both armed resistance and the goal of a revolutionary restructuring of Yugoslavia along socialist lines. Their ranks included Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and others, though in the early stages their activity was strongest in central Serbia. At the same time, another resistance movement emerged under the command of Colonel Draža Mihailović, based in the Ravna Gora region. Known as the Chetniks, these royalist forces pledged loyalty to the exiled King Peter II and aimed to restore the pre-war monarchy. Unlike the Partisans, they sought to avoid direct confrontation with the Germans until a more favorable moment, focusing instead on preserving their forces and preparing for an eventual Allied landing in the Balkans. Initially, contacts between Partisans and Chetniks were cooperative, as both opposed the occupiers. However, ideological differences and divergent strategies soon drove them apart, turning potential allies into rivals. In Croatia and Bosnia, the establishment of the independent state of Croatia introduced another layer of conflict. The Ustaše regime, under Ante Pavelić, pursued radical policies of ethnic engineering, targeting Serbs, Jews, and Roma populations with persecution, forced conversions, deportations, and mass killings. The establishment of concentration camps such as Jasenovac became emblematic of the regime's brutality. These actions provoked widespread resistance, particularly among Serb communities in Bosnia and Croatia, where local insurgencies erupted during the summer of 1941. Some of these groups aligned with the Chetniks, while others gravitated toward the Partisans, deepening the split between ideological and ethnic lines of resistance. Italian occupation zones presented a contrasting environment. In Dalmatia, Montenegro, and parts of Slovenia, Italian forces adopted comparatively softer administrative policies, seeking to win local cooperation. Yet even here, resistance emerged, especially in Montenegro, where a communist-led uprising broke out in July 1941. The Italians responded with reinforcements, but the rebellion signaled that no part of occupied Yugoslavia would remain stable for long. In Macedonia, under Bulgarian administration, assimilation policies such as mandatory use of the Bulgarian language and suppression of Serbian institutions fueled resentment, though organized resistance developed more slowly. The German authorities recognized the danger of fragmented but widespread uprisings. In September 1941, Berlin authorized a large-scale anti-insurgency campaign in Serbia. Units of the Wehrmacht, supported by SS formations, launched operations against partisan strongholds. Villages suspected of aiding rebels were destroyed, and entire populations deported or executed. These reprisals inflicted heavy civilian losses but failed to eliminate the insurgency. Instead, they hardened local resistance and forced guerrilla fighters to adopt more mobile tactics, retreating into remote areas and continuing attacks on supply lines and garrisons. The opening clashes of 1941 thus established the contours of the coming struggle. Resistance movements emerged not as a single front, but as competing forces shaped by ideology, ethnicity, and geography. Collaborationist administrations tried to stabilize Axis control, but faced growing opposition. For civilians, daily life was marked by uncertainty, shifting allegiances, reprisals, and the constant threat of violence. By the end of 1941, Yugoslavia had become not just an occupied territory, but a battlefield of intersecting wars: occupation versus resistance, communists versus royalists, and ethnic communities against regimes that sought their elimination. These early engagements laid the foundation for one of the most complex and brutal theaters of the Second World War. By the beginning of 1942, the conflict in occupied Yugoslavia had entered a new and more complicated phase. The initial uprisings of the previous summer had been met with brutal reprisals, yet resistance had not disappeared. Instead, it evolved, expanded, and began to reorganize along clearer lines. The country was now divided not only by Axis occupation zones, but also by competing armed movements whose visions for the future of Yugoslavia diverged sharply. The war in the Balkans was no longer simply a matter of Axis forces versus insurgents. It had become a multi-front struggle involving foreign armies, collaborationist regimes, partisans, Chetniks, and civilians caught between them. The Chetniks under Draja Mihailović consolidated their position in the mountainous regions of western Serbia, eastern Bosnia, and Montenegro. Initially recognized by the Yugoslav government in exile in London as the legitimate resistance, they sought to maintain a strategy of selective engagement. Mihailović believed that premature confrontation with German forces would invite massive reprisals against the Serbian population and weaken his ability to preserve manpower for the decisive moment, an anticipated Allied landing in the Balkans. This cautious approach led to tactical arrangements with Italian occupation forces in some areas, where Chetnik units accepted weapons and supplies in exchange for limiting attacks on Axis garrisons. While framed as pragmatic, such cooperation created tension with other resistance groups and later undermined the Chetniks' reputation among the Allies. The Partisans, led by Josip Broz Tito, pursued a markedly different strategy. Based initially in western Serbia, but increasingly active in Bosnia, Croatia, and Slovenia, they adopted a doctrine of continuous guerrilla warfare. Their goal was not only liberation from Axis occupation, but also a revolutionary transformation of society. Partisan units were organized into mobile detachments, supported by clandestine political committees in villages and towns. By 1942, the movement had established liberated territories, where they introduced rudimentary administrations, schools, and hospitals, presenting themselves as an alternative government. The partisans also emphasized the multi-ethnic character of their struggle, recruiting Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Muslims, and others under a banner of brotherhood and unity. This contrasted with the Chetniks' predominantly Serbian composition and royalist orientation. The Axis response was to intensify counterinsurgency operations. In January 1942, German forces, supported by Croatian and Italian units, launched offensives in eastern Bosnia aimed at crushing partisan bases. Operations Weiss and Schwarz, conducted over the course of 1942 and 1943, mobilized tens of thousands of German, Italian, and Croatian troops against partisan concentrations. These campaigns were characterized by sweeping maneuvers, encirclement tactics, and harsh reprisals against civilians suspected of aiding guerrillas. While inflicting heavy casualties, they failed to achieve decisive results. Partisan detachments, though suffering losses, repeatedly broke through encirclements, retreating into remote mountain areas and re-emerging elsewhere to continue operations. Civilian populations bore the heaviest burden during this escalation. German reprisal policies remained in force, leading to the execution of thousands in mass shootings, particularly in Serbia. In Bosnia and Croatia, the Ustaše regime pursued its campaign of persecution against Serbs, Jews, and Roma, combining state policy with paramilitary violence. Entire villages were destroyed, and survivors forced into camps such as Jasenovac. These actions created streams of refugees, swelling the ranks of both partisan and Chetnik forces, as civilians sought protection or retribution. In Slovenia, German annexation policies included forced Germanization, deportations, and the resettlement of ethnic Germans, further fueling resistance. The international dimension of the conflict also became more pronounced. Britain and the United States monitored events through intelligence networks, initially favoring Mihailović and the Chetniks as legitimate representatives of Yugoslav resistance. Reports of their limited engagement against Germans and instances of collaboration, however, began to raise doubts. Simultaneously, Soviet interest in the Balkans grew as the Eastern Front expanded, with Moscow encouraging local communist parties to intensify armed struggle. By mid-1942, Yugoslavia had become not just a regional battleground, but a point of strategic consideration for both Allied and Axis planners. Economically, the escalation deepened the exploitation of Yugoslavia's resources. German authorities extracted metals, food, and timber, while Italy and Hungary integrated occupied zones into their economies. Guerrilla activity, however, disrupted supply lines, railroads, and mines, forcing the Axis to divert significant manpower to guard duties. Sabotage became a key weapon of the partisans, who targeted bridges, railways, and factories to undermine the occupiers' logistical capacity. These operations, though costly, demonstrated the growing sophistication and reach of the resistance. By the end of 1942, the war in Yugoslavia had assumed the character of a grinding internal and external struggle. The Chetniks, cautious and increasingly entangled with local arrangements, contrasted sharply with the expanding, mobile, and radical partisan movement. Axis forces, despite large-scale operations, could not pacify the countryside. Civilians endured the consequences of reprisals, persecution, and economic exploitation. The escalation of the conflict highlighted both the fragmentation of loyalties and the determination of multiple actors to shape the future of Yugoslavia, setting the stage for even more intense confrontations in the years ahead. By early 1943, the conflict in Yugoslavia had reached a scale and intensity that drew the attention of all major powers involved in the wider war. The Balkans were no longer a quiet occupation zone, but an active front of guerrilla warfare, mass reprisals, and shifting alliances. The year would see the largest military operations against the resistance in the region, as well as decisive shifts in the balance between the rival insurgent movements. The struggle had now become a complex mix of Axis counteroffensives, partisan survival strategies, Chetnik realignments, and growing Allied involvement. The Axis command recognized that guerrilla activity was undermining their ability to exploit resources and maintain secure communication lines through the Balkans. In response, they launched two major coordinated campaigns against the Partisans. Operation Weiss, the Battle of the Neretva, in early 1943, and Operation Schwarz, the Battle of the Sutjeska, in May and June. Both involved tens of thousands of German, Italian, Croatian, and Bulgarian troops, supported by artillery and aircraft, with the goal of encircling and annihilating Tito's main forces. The scale of these operations demonstrated the seriousness with which Berlin regarded the Yugoslav resistance, forcing the diversion of divisions that might otherwise have been deployed on the Eastern Front. Operation Weiss began in January 1943, targeting partisan forces concentrated in western Bosnia and northern Herzegovina. Around 9,000 Axis troops were deployed against approximately 2,000 partisans. The campaign forced the partisans into a fighting retreat toward the Neretva River. In one of the most dramatic episodes of the war in Yugoslavia, partisan engineers destroyed and then hastily rebuilt a bridge across the river under fire, enabling Tito's forces to escape encirclement. Though they suffered significant losses, estimated at around 7,500 killed, the partisans preserved their core strength and demonstrated resilience that enhanced their reputation both domestically and abroad. Operation Schwarz, launched in May 1943, was even larger in scope. Roughly 7,000 Axis troops, including German divisions and Italian, Croatian, and Bulgarian contingents, surrounded about 22,000 partisans in the mountainous region of Sutjeska. The battle lasted for several weeks and inflicted severe casualties on the partisans, with over 7,000 killed and many wounded. Yet, once again, encirclement failed to achieve its goal. Tito himself was injured during the fighting, but survived, and the partisan leadership managed to break through Axis lines. The ability of a numerically inferior and poorly equipped force to withstand such concentrated offensives became a symbol of determination and further elevated the movement's stature. The Chetniks, meanwhile, followed a different trajectory. Mihailović's policy of avoiding large-scale battles with German forces increasingly led to accusations of inactivity or collaboration. In areas under Italian occupation, Chetnik units often received arms and supplies from Italian garrisons in exchange for suppressing partisan activity. While this allowed them to preserve strength, it also aligned them, at least temporarily, with Axis objectives. Reports of such arrangements reached the Allies, undermining confidence in the Chetniks as reliable partners. Within Yugoslavia, tensions between Chetniks and partisans escalated into open conflict, with both sides engaging in clashes that diverted resources away from fighting the occupiers. These internal battles deepened the civil war dimension of the conflict. The situation was further transformed in September 1943, when Italy capitulated to the Allies. Italian troops stationed across Dalmatia, Montenegro, and Slovenia suddenly found themselves without clear orders. Partisans quickly moved to seize weapons, ammunition, and territory abandoned by retreating Italian units. This windfall provided them with badly needed heavy equipment, including artillery, mortars, and even tanks. The collapse of Italian authority also allowed the partisans to establish larger liberated zones along the Adriatic coast, strengthening their logistical base and opening the possibility of closer contact with Allied forces. For the Chetniks, however, the loss of their main supplier and occasional protector in Italian zones weakened their position significantly. Allied policy began to shift accordingly. British missions, which had been attached to both Chetnik and partisan headquarters, increasingly reported the greater effectiveness of the partisans in engaging Axis troops. Intelligence assessments contrasted the limited operations of Mihailović's forces with the continuous and large-scale resistance of Tito's detachments. By late 1943, this reassessment led to a gradual transfer of Allied support from the Chetniks to the partisans. Material aid, including weapons, radio equipment, and medical supplies, began to flow through airdrops, signaling a decisive change in international recognition. For civilians, 1943 brought intensified suffering. Axis reprisals continued, particularly in German zones, where mass executions followed guerrilla attacks. The Ustaše regime in the independent state of Croatia pursued its campaigns of persecution, leading to further deportations and killings. Refugee flows increased as populations fled areas of combat or persecution, often ending up in precarious conditions in liberated zones or mountainous terrain. Yet, within liberated territories, the partisans attempted to establish systems of governance, including people's councils, schools, and rudimentary courts. These structures provided a glimpse of an alternative political order, contrasting with both Axis occupation and the royalist vision of the Chetniks. By the end of 1943, Yugoslavia's war had reached its peak intensity. The Axis had launched massive offensives but failed to crush the resistance. The partisans, though bloodied, emerged stronger, better armed, and increasingly recognized abroad. The Chetniks, once the favored partner of the Allies, found themselves isolated and embroiled in conflicts that eroded their legitimacy. The civilian population remained at the center of violence, reprisals, and displacement, experiencing the war as a daily struggle for survival. The events of this year transformed the trajectory of the Balkan front, laying the groundwork for Yugoslavia's role as one of the most significant resistance movements in occupied Europe. Through the winter of 1943 and into 1944, Yugoslavia's resistance war entered a phase of consolidation and transformation. The failure of the massive Axis offensives of the previous year had not eliminated the partisans. Instead, it had strengthened their reputation as the most resilient and effective force in the Balkans. The collapse of Italy had brought them new weaponry, territory, and opportunities, while the Chetniks found themselves increasingly marginalized. This shift, combined with growing Allied recognition, set the stage for Yugoslavia to emerge as a central theater of resistance in Europe. The partisans reorganized their forces into larger and more structured formations. In November 1942, the Supreme Headquarters had already declared the creation of the Anti-Fascist Council for the National Liberation of Yugoslavia, AVNOJ, but by late 1943 and early 1944, this body began to function as a proto-government. In liberated areas across Bosnia, Croatia, and Montenegro, local councils were established under AVNOJ's authority, coordinating administration, supply, and political education. The movement's emphasis on multi-ethnic unity, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Muslims, Montenegrins, and Macedonians, contrasted with the ethnic exclusivism of the Ustaše regime and the royalist orientation of the Chetniks. These developments gave the partisans both military momentum and political legitimacy. The Chetniks, however, faced a crisis. Draža Mihailović continued to hold significant forces, particularly in Serbia, Montenegro, and Bosnia, but his strategy of waiting for an Allied landing seemed increasingly out of step with the realities on the ground. His forces engaged in clashes with the partisans more often than with the Germans, and in some areas they even collaborated with Axis garrisons against their communist rivals. Reports from Allied liaison officers confirmed these tendencies, eroding the Western support. By 1944, the British and Americans had effectively shifted their recognition from Mihailović to Tito, supplying the partisans with arms and equipment via airdrops, and establishing coordination through missions such as Fitzroy McLean's in Bosnia. Axis occupation policies further radicalized the conflict. In Serbia, German authorities continued to enforce harsh reprisals, executing thousands in retaliation for attacks on railways or garrisons. In the independent state of Croatia, the Ustaše regime intensified persecution, carrying out mass killings and deportations that depopulated entire regions. These measures generated a constant flow of recruits to resistance groups, though divided between Chetniks and partisans depending on location and ideology. In Slovenia, German annexation brought forced conscription into Wehrmacht units and mass deportations, which spurred the growth of local partisan detachments. In Macedonia, Bulgarian rule persisted, accompanied by cultural assimilation policies, yet resistance there also expanded, increasingly tied to Tito's movement. The Soviet Union's advances on the Eastern Front in 1943 and early 1944 reshaped the strategic picture. With the Red Army moving westward, Germany faced the prospect of a Balkan front collapsing. This heightened the importance of Yugoslavia as both a defensive line and a source of resources. German commanders sought to stabilize the region by reinforcing garrisons and attempting to destroy the partisans once more, but the growing scale of guerrilla warfare forced them into a defensive posture. Meanwhile, Allied interest in supporting a viable Balkan resistance that could tie down German divisions made Tito a central figure in wider strategic planning. Civilian experiences reflected this intensification. In areas controlled by the partisans, life was precarious but organized. Schools functioned, local administrations distributed food, and partisan hospitals treated the wounded. Yet these zones were constantly under threat of Axis raids, and reprisals could wipe out entire villages suspected of collaboration. In German or Ustaše zones, repression and terror were daily realities. In Italian zones, after September 1943, the sudden collapse of order left populations exposed to reprisals from both Germans and local collaborators until partisan units moved in. The shifting front lines meant that civilians often passed through multiple regimes of authority within months, forcing repeated adaptation for survival. The year 1944 thus marked a turning point. The partisans were no longer a fragmented guerrilla force, but a de facto national army, supported by Allied recognition and increasingly supplied with modern arms. The Chetniks, once central to Allied planning, were relegated to a secondary role, viewed with suspicion for their collaborationist tendencies. The Axis, though still powerful, could no longer impose decisive control, forced instead into costly counterinsurgency campaigns that drained resources. Civilians remained trapped in the middle, enduring persecution, reprisals, and the hardships of war, but also witnessing the emergence of new political structures that pointed toward a post-war transformation of Yugoslavia. The stage was set for decisive battles and the re-entry of global powers into the Balkan theater. By mid-1944, the Yugoslav conflict entered a decisive stage as global shifts in the war began to influence the Balkans directly. The collapse of German positions on the Eastern Front and the advancing Red Army transformed the strategic balance. For the Axis, Yugoslavia remained critical as a defensive buffer and as a route of withdrawal from Greece and the Aegean. For the Allies, the resistance movements offered a means of tying down German divisions and hastening the liberation of southeastern Europe. Within Yugoslavia itself, the rivalry between partisans and Chetniks had reached a point where the outcome would determine the political order of the future state. The partisans' military growth was remarkable. By the summer of 1944, they had organized several corps and divisions, operating not merely as guerrillas, but as a structured army capable of conventional operations. Their strength, estimated at around 2,000 fighters, was supplemented by networks of local supporters who provided intelligence, supplies, and recruits. Allied air support, now coordinated from Italy, supplied them with weapons, ammunition, and medical supplies. Missions such as Fitzroy McLean's liaison with Tito's headquarters ensured closer synchronization of partisan operations with Allied strategy. This external backing, combined with the movement's internal organization, gave the partisans a level of military and political credibility, unmatched by other groups in occupied Yugoslavia. The Chetniks, in contrast, faced growing isolation. Though still numbering in the tens of thousands, their operations were increasingly defensive and often directed against the partisans rather than the Germans. Mihailović's forces maintained contact with the Yugoslav government in exile, but British and American recognition had shifted decisively toward Tito. Reports of collaboration with Axis forces, whether in the form of truces, joint operations against partisans, or acceptance of supplies, undermined their legitimacy abroad. Within Yugoslavia, the Chetniks retained influence in parts of Serbia and Montenegro, but struggled to present themselves as a national movement. The perception that they represented primarily Serbian royalist interests further limited their appeal in multi-ethnic areas. German authorities launched further counteroffensives in 1944 to contain the partisans and secure withdrawal routes from Greece. Operations in Dalmatia, Bosnia, and Serbia aimed to disrupt partisan strongholds, but these efforts achieved limited success. The partisans' mobility, combined with growing support from the population and Allied coordination, allowed them to evade destruction and inflict increasing damage on German supply lines. By late summer, partisan units were intercepting columns, sabotaging railways, and even engaging in set-piece battles, demonstrating their transformation into a regular fighting force. The turning point came with the approach of the Red Army. In September 1944, Soviet forces crossed into the Balkans, advancing through Romania and Bulgaria. German units, already overstretched, faced the prospect of encirclement. In Serbia, the Partisans launched coordinated offensives alongside Soviet units, culminating in the liberation of Belgrade in October 1944. The joint operation, involving approximately 400,000 troops, marked the most significant conventional battle fought on Yugoslav territory during the war. For Tito and the Partisans, cooperation with the Soviets provided both military support and political prestige, cementing their role as the dominant force in Yugoslavia's liberation. Meanwhile, other parts of the country saw rapid change. In Macedonia, Bulgarian forces switched sides after the Soviet entry into their territory, joining operations against the Germans. In Slovenia and Croatia, partisan advances liberated large areas, though fighting remained fierce as retreating German and Ustaše units sought to maintain control. Italian territory along the Adriatic, left in disarray after the 1943 armistice, became a key base for Allied supplies and air operations in support of partisan forces. By the end of 1944, most of Yugoslavia was either liberated or contested, with the Axis confined to retreat corridors toward Austria and Hungary. For civilians, the year brought both relief and new hardship. Liberation often meant the end of direct occupation, but also the imposition of new demands by partisan authorities: recruitment, requisition of food, and participation in political organizations. In zones still held by the Axis or their collaborators, repression intensified as the occupiers sought to maintain control in the face of imminent defeat. The transition was rarely smooth, and communities often found themselves torn between competing forces, each claiming authority and legitimacy. Yet the momentum of events was clear: the collapse of Axis power and the rise of the Partisans as the recognized leadership of the Yugoslav struggle. By the close of 1944, Yugoslavia had undergone a fundamental transformation. The Partisans, once a small guerrilla movement, had become the central military and political authority, supported by both the Allies and the Soviet Union. The Chetniks, reduced in influence and credibility, were on the path to defeat. The Axis, once dominant, was in retreat, fighting a delaying action against forces it could no longer contain. The Balkan crossroads had shifted again, with Yugoslavia poised to emerge from occupation not as a restored monarchy, but as a revolutionary state shaped by the experience of war and resistance. The final year of the war in Yugoslavia unfolded as a sequence of retreats, reprisals, and last attempts by Axis forces and their collaborators to hold on to fragments of power. By early 1945, German forces were withdrawing steadily from the Balkans toward Austria and Hungary, while Tito's partisans, reinforced by Soviet cooperation and Allied support, pressed their advantage. The conflict, however, did not end with the German retreat alone. The collapse of occupation left unresolved the bitter internal divisions that had defined the Yugoslav war since 1941. As one order disintegrated, another emerged, shaped not only by battlefield victories but also by political authority imposed in liberated regions. In Serbia, the joint operations of the Red Army and Partisans in late 1944 had already liberated Belgrade, but fighting continued in northern areas along the Danube and in Vojvodina. German Army Group E, retreating from Greece through Macedonia and Serbia, sought to maintain open corridors toward Bosnia and Croatia. These movements provoked fierce engagements with partisan units, now organized into multiple armies with tens of thousands of fighters. The battles of the winter and spring of 1945 centered on controlling communication lines, particularly railways and river crossings, vital for both retreating Axis formations and advancing resistance forces. In many instances, partisans fought against rearguard German detachments supported by Ustaše and Chetnik auxiliaries, demonstrating the continued complexity of the conflict even in its final months. In Croatia and Bosnia, the independent state of Croatia, under Ante Pavelić, clung to existence, but its authority was collapsing. Ustaše forces, backed by German divisions, carried out mass evacuations from areas threatened by partisan advances. Civilians, particularly those associated with the regime or fearing retribution, fled westward in long columns, converging on routes leading toward Austria. For the partisans, the pursuit of these retreating forces was both a military and political task. Military because German divisions and Ustaše units remained armed and dangerous. Political because the capture of collaborators would serve as a foundation for the post-war order. The result was a chaotic mixture of combat, flight, and reprisal, with villages and towns changing hands repeatedly. In Slovenia, German occupation forces attempted to establish defensive lines in the Alpine foothills, seeking to delay the Allied advance into Austria. Local partisan formations, already strong in the region, intensified operations, harassing convoys, seizing depots, and cutting communications. The Slovenian theater became one of the final staging grounds for German withdrawal, as divisions from the Balkans regrouped for a last stand in Austria. Here, too, the population faced dislocation, with tens of thousands displaced in the final months of the war, caught between advancing partisans and retreating Axis forces. The Chetniks, by 1945, had lost most of their influence. Mihailović attempted to maintain control over remnants of his forces in Serbia and Bosnia, but their numbers dwindled as defections to the partisans increased. In some areas, Chetnik units continued limited engagements, but in others they retreated alongside German or Ustaše formations, hoping to avoid capture by the partisans. Allied recognition, long since withdrawn, left them without external support, and their reputation suffered from both collaborationist episodes and their failure to present a viable alternative to Tito's movement. By the spring of 1945, the Chetniks were no longer a decisive actor in the conflict, reduced instead to scattered groups awaiting the outcome of the war. For civilians, the final months were marked by extraordinary hardship. As Axis forces retreated, scorched earth tactics destroyed infrastructure, railways, and food supplies. Reprisals continued, especially in areas where partisan attacks disrupted withdrawals. Refugee movements reached their peak, with hundreds of thousands of people, soldiers, collaborators, and civilians, on the roads toward Austria and Italy. Camps, makeshift shelters, and improvised convoys stretched across the landscape, reflecting both fear of partisan reprisals and the hope of surrendering to Western Allied forces rather than falling into Soviet or partisan hands. The final battles culminated in May 1945. In Croatia and Slovenia, large German and Ustaše formations attempted to break through to Austria, hoping to surrender to British forces. The partisans, pursuing them relentlessly, engaged in some of the heaviest fighting of the campaign. The battles around the town of Celje and near the Austrian border ended with massive surrenders and captures. Tens of thousands of German troops were taken prisoner, alongside large numbers of Ustaše, Chetniks, and other collaborationist forces. The collapse of organized resistance effectively ended Axis power in Yugoslavia, though scattered units continued to fight or flee for days afterward. As the war ended in Europe on 8 May 1945, Yugoslavia stood transformed. Axis occupation was over, but the price had been enormous: hundreds of thousands of civilians killed, widespread destruction of infrastructure, and entire communities displaced. The rivalries that had defined the war, occupation versus resistance, partisans versus Chetniks, ethnic divisions across the country, did not disappear immediately, but instead flowed into the politics of the post-war order. The partisans, victorious both militarily and politically, began the process of consolidating control across the country, dealing with prisoners, refugees, and collaborators in ways that would shape Yugoslavia's immediate post-war experience. The war had ended, but its aftermath promised further upheaval. The war's conclusion in May 1945 did not simply bring liberation to Yugoslavia, but also initiated a profound reordering of its political and social fabric. The partisans, having emerged as the dominant resistance force, immediately moved to consolidate power. Their military victory was accompanied by the establishment of a new political framework that rejected both the pre-war monarchy and the fragmented occupation order imposed by the Axis. The Anti-Fascist Council for the National Liberation of Yugoslavia, AVNOJ, which had been functioning as a proto-government since 1943, now assumed full authority. Meeting in Jajci in November 1943, it had already declared itself the supreme legislative body, and by 1945 it operated as the foundation of a new state. King Peter II, still in exile, was effectively excluded from any role in post-war governance. The immediate aftermath was marked by the liquidation of collaborationist forces. Tens of thousands of Ustaše, Chetniks, Slovenian Home Guard, and other Axis-aligned troops who had retreated toward Austria in the final weeks of the war were captured by the Partisans or handed over by the British at the Austrian border. Many were executed or imprisoned without formal trials, in what became known as the Bleiburg repatriations. While intended to eliminate potential opposition to the new regime, these reprisals deepened wounds across ethnic and political communities, leaving legacies of bitterness that would resurface decades later. For civilians, the transition often meant sudden reversals of fortune. Those who had survived under Axis or collaborationist administrations now faced suspicion, while others who had supported the Partisans assumed positions of local authority. The human cost of the war in Yugoslavia was immense. Estimates suggest that between 1 and 1.7 million people died within its borders between 1941 and 1945, including soldiers, civilians, and victims of persecution. The independent state of Croatia's policies of extermination and deportation had decimated Serb, Jewish, and Roma communities. German reprisals, famine, disease, and forced labor further added to the toll. Villages had been destroyed, infrastructure ruined, and cities such as Belgrade and Zagreb scarred by bombing and fighting. Displacement was widespread, with hundreds of thousands uprooted by shifting front lines, deportations, or refugee movements. The country that re-emerged in 1945 was both victorious and devastated. Internationally, the new Yugoslavia found itself at a crossroads between East and West. Tito's partisans had cooperated with the Soviet Union in liberating Belgrade, but they had also received significant aid from Britain and the United States. This dual support gave the new regime a degree of independence unusual in Eastern Europe. In 1945, Yugoslavia was established as the Democratic Federal Yugoslavia, soon renamed the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia, a socialist state composed of 6 republics: Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, and Macedonia. This federal structure was intended to address the national questions that had plagued the pre-war monarchy by granting autonomy within a unified socialist framework. Whether this arrangement would resolve or merely postpone ethnic tensions remained to be seen. The legacy of the wartime conflict was thus layered and complex. For some, the Partisans represented liberation and the promise of a new egalitarian order. For others, especially those connected to defeated factions, the end of the war meant persecution, loss, and exile. The destruction of the monarchy and the rise of a communist-led federation marked a profound political shift, while memories of occupation, collaboration, and civil war left scars across communities. The Yugoslav War had not been a single struggle, but many overlapping ones, against foreign occupation, between rival visions of the state, and among ethnic groups with competing aspirations. In the broader context of the Second World War, Yugoslavia's resistance movement stood out as one of the most active and effective in occupied Europe, tying down significant Axis forces and contributing to the weakening of Germany's southern flank. Yet its internal divisions foreshadowed future conflicts. The Partisans' emphasis on brotherhood and unity sought to overcome the fractures exposed during the war. But the violence of occupation, collaboration, and reprisal left deep undercurrents of mistrust. The collapse of Yugoslavia in 1941 had reshaped the Balkans, but so too did its reconstitution in 1945, this time under a revolutionary model that promised unity through socialism. The war had thus remade Yugoslavia entirely, from a fragile monarchy fractured by ethnic tensions, through a brutal occupation marked by civil strife, to a socialist federation forged in armed resistance. The legacy of those years would define the country for decades, both in its strength as a federal state that resisted domination by either East or West, and in the unresolved tensions that would, in time, resurface. The Balkan crossroads had once again shifted, leaving a state reborn from war but haunted by the memory of its collapse.